Norway just passed 1 million electric vehicles. 1 million in a country of 5 million people. And the market share numbers are almost surreal. In February 2026, battery electric vehicles achieved 98% of all new car registrations. Combustion engines have essentially become a statistical footnote. Norway has done something no other country has done. It has basically ended the sale of fossil fuel passenger cars, a decade ahead of the European Union's own target. And now the question is, what comes next? The government and Enova, the state energy agency, are looking at heavy transport, trucks, buses, ferries. Norway has set a target for all new trucks to be zero emission by 2030. Transport Minister has stated that emissions from heavy transport must be cut sharply to reach Norway's climate targets. So I want to do something in this episode that the headlines rarely do. I want to look at what total transport electrification actually means as a systems challenge, not as a political goal, but as an engineering and governance problem, with all its hidden pressures, unresolved tensions, and one paradox that I find genuinely difficult to look away from. Welcome back to the Cascade. I am Omid Razbani, Associate Professor of Systems Engineering. Let me give you some context first. The transformation of Norway's passenger car market was the result of a sustained multi-decade policy effort. Combustion engine vehicles were heavily taxed. Electric vehicles were exempted from most of those taxes, from VAT, from toll charges, and for a long time from ferry fees. Public charging infrastructure was built out with government support. The combination of punishing conventional cars and rewarding electric ones reshaped consumer behavior faster than almost anyone predicted. In 2012, electric cars accounted for just 2.8% of new car sales in Norway. By 2026, the figure had reached 98%. The policy is now changing. Having largely achieved its passenger car goals, Norway is beginning to phase out the very incentives that got it there. The VAT-free threshold for EVs was reduced in January 2026, with further reductions planned through 2027 and 2028. The reason is logical. Now that EVs are the norm, the original justification for subsidies have weakened. But here is the first systems observation I want to make. The passenger car transformation worked partly because it was a relatively simple challenge, a uniform product, charged at home, overnight, on a grid that had enough slack to absorb gradual growth. The policy toolkit could be applied uniformly at scale. Heavy transport is not that. A heavy truck is completely different from a passenger car. A large, long-haul truck needs to carry hundreds of kilowatt hours of energy to cover meaningful distances with a full load. Charging that battery fast enough to be commercially viable, fast enough that the truck does not sit idle for hours, requires charging at power levels of 1 megawatt or more. 1 megawatt. That is the equivalent of roughly 500 to 1,000 homes charging simultaneously from a single charging point. Now imagine a truck stop on the E6, Norway's main north-south highway, with 20 charging points. That is potentially 20 megawatts appearing at a single location on the distribution grid, a location that was not designed for it, in a geography that is often remote, poorly served by existing grid infrastructure, and very expensive to upgrade. Enova has founded 19 megawatt charging locations along 4 primary transport corridors in southern Norway. That is a start. But Norway has thousands of kilometers of transport corridors. And in the north, the grid situation is right now in active crisis. On April 22, 2026, Statnett issued 2 press releases that caused shockwaves through the Arctic business community. Statnett announced a complete halt on new power reservations for industrial projects north of Svartisen. All new connections exceeding 5 megawatts would be postponed indefinitely. In the most constrained areas, in eastern Finnmark, the limit for normal consumption was reduced to just 1 megawatt. 1 megawatt is equivalent to 3 fast charging points for electric vehicles. The maximum new connection limit for the whole of northern Norway is now equivalent to 3 electric vehicle chargers. Statnett was blunt about why. The grid in northern Norway is fully utilized and cannot withstand more load without the risk of overload and power outage. The queue of pending industrial projects waiting to connect has reached roughly 1,100 megawatts, effectively choking the system. The reinforcement infrastructure that would fix this is not expected until 2032 at the earliest, and in some areas, 2040. This is the mismatched tempo problem from episode 1, policy and ambition moving at the speed of political will. Grid infrastructure moving at the speed of civil engineering. The two are not synchronized. And in the meantime, the trucks that are supposed to be electric will either not be electric or they will not operate in northern Norway. But there is something even more striking about the northern Norway situation, and this is where the Salten Kraftsamband story comes in. The NRK recently reported on a frustrating situation facing Salten Kraftsamband, a hydroelectric operator in Nordland. Their plants are producing electricity, but the transmission grid in northern Norway has no room to carry it to where it is needed. So the water, the energy, is literally being routed past the turbines and discharged to the sea. Think about that for a moment. The same grid that cannot accept new industrial connections, that cannot support the charging infrastructure for electric trucks, is also unable to carry all the clean electricity that is already being produced. Energy is being wasted because the grid connecting the production to consumption is undersized. Both problems, too much supply in one place, too little capacity to connect new consumers elsewhere, have the same root cause. The transmission system was not built for the demands now being placed on it. And there is a proposal on the table to address this. Statnett has been discussing relaxing something called the N-1 principle, the engineering standard that requires the grid to stay operational even if one major component fails. By relaxing this reserve requirement, you could squeeze more capacity out of existing lines. But critics argue that this is exactly the wrong response to a stressed system. Removing a safety margin from a grid that is already at its limit is not an upgrade. It is a risk transfer. I call this robbing the buffer. You solve today's capacity problem by consuming the safety margin that was designed for tomorrow's unexpected event. There is a deeper assumption sitting underneath Norway's entire electrification strategy that almost nobody discusses publicly. Norway generates nearly all of its electricity from hydropower, and people generally treat this as an unconditional strength. Clean, renewable, flexible, domestically controlled, all of which is true. But hydropower is weather dependent, and that dependency is not insignificant. It is a fundamental characteristic of the system. In 2022, Norway experienced lower than normal precipitation. The result was that the total electricity production fell to 146 terawatt hours, compared to the normal figure of around 157. An 11 terawatt hour shortfall. Electricity prices in Norway, which had been cheap for decades, spiked dramatically. It created genuine political controversy and a public debate about why a country sitting on a hydro system was suddenly paying European electricity prices. And this year, the situation is more acute. Norway experienced its coldest winter since 2010. High pressure near Greenland blocked the moist Atlantic air that normally brings precipitation to Norway. Snow reserves fell to their lowest level in 2 decades. The energy deficit created by this single weather event is estimated at around 25 terawatt hours, equivalent to roughly 20% of Norway's normal annual hydropower output. Now, hold that thought. Norway is planning to add enormous new electricity demand to this weather-dependent system. Data centers, electric trucks, ferry electrification, offshore platform electrification, industrial electrification, all of it stacking off on a grid whose generation capacity varies by tens of terawatt hours from one year to the next, depending on how much it rains and snows. DNV has projected that Norway is heading toward a power deficit by 2030, with expected annual net import in the early 2030s. Norway, currently an electricity exporter, may become an electricity importer within a few years. Going from surplus to deficit will have consequences, not just for Norwegian consumers, but for the Nordic and European countries that currently rely on Norwegian hydropower as a stabilizing resource. The International Energy Agency has noted that climate change will likely alter precipitation patterns further. Overall precipitation in Norway may increase over the century, which would be positive for hydro production, but the seasonal distribution will change. More precipitation in winter, less in summer, potentially widening the gap between surplus and deficit periods and making the system harder to manage. Hydropower is flexible. Norway's large reservoirs can store water across seasons and even across years, but they cannot store it indefinitely. And as new demand sources arrive faster than new generation or grid capacity can be built, the margin between supply and demand gets thinner. When you deliberately run a system closer to its limit, variability stops being a manageable issue and starts being a potential trigger for the kind of cascade we discussed in episode 2. Now I want to raise something that is getting very little attention in the public debate about transport electrification. Norway is moving towards a transport system that is almost entirely dependent on electricity. That is manageable as long as the electricity supply is reliable. But as we discussed in episode 1 and 2, electricity supply is not unconditionally reliable. The Spain-Portugal blackout lasted up to 16 hours. The US grid was genuinely stressed by AI data center loads this spring. And as I just described, Norway's hydro-based system is exposed to weather variability in ways that are easy to underestimate. The petrol station network is contracting. In 1969, Norway had more than 4,000 petrol stations. By 2012, the number was already down to around 1,200. 430 petrol stations have been shut down in the past 5 years. As EV adoption deepens and fossil fuel sales volumes fall, the commercial viability of the remaining stations weakens. Closure will continue. At some point, the network will fall below the threshold needed to provide meaningful coverage across Norway's geography. Once that infrastructure is gone, it cannot quickly be rebuilt. Petrol stations require permits, construction, supply chains, and commercial viability. A grid outage lasting 48 hours in a fully electrified transport system does not just inconvenience people. It stops trucks, it grounds the logistics network, it stops emergency vehicles without functioning charging infrastructure. This is a reduction of redundancy. The old system, for all its faults, had one property that new one risks losing: the ability to continue operating when one critical component fails. Multiple energy sources, multiple fuel networks, multiple failure modes that did not all cascade from the same root cause. Now I want to raise the most uncomfortable question of this episode. Norway produces and exports large quantities of oil and natural gas. Following the Russian and Ukraine conflict, Norway overtook Russia as Europe's largest natural gas supplier. Norway is the world's 8th largest natural gas producer and 12th largest crude oil producer. When Norwegian oil and gas is burned abroad, those emissions appear in the accounts of the countries that burn it. They do not appear in Norwegian emissions statistics. Norway's domestic greenhouse gas emissions are around 44 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. But the annual emissions from combustion of exported Norwegian oil and gas are approximately 500 million tons, 10 times Norway's domestic emissions exported, not counted. Norway faces a profound paradox. Its economic prosperity relies heavily on hydrocarbon production, yet it champions some of the world's most ambitious climate policies. Viewed comprehensively, Norway is a significant greenhouse gas emitter. Now I want to be careful here because I'm not making a simple moral argument. Norway's response to this is, if Norway does not sell the oil and gas, someone else will. Global demand is not determined by Norwegian supply decisions alone, and Norway uses the revenues through its sovereign wealth fund to fund the domestic energy transition and global climate initiatives. These arguments have real force. I do not dismiss them. But supply shapes demand. Cheap, abundant, reliable fossil fuel supply suppresses the urgency of transition in the countries that consume it. It keeps alternatives economically marginal. It maintains infrastructure and habits that make fossil fuel consumption the path of least resistance. At Norway's scale of production, supply decisions do matter at the margin. And at the margin is exactly where energy transitions are won or lost. There is also a question of boundary selection. When Norway draws the boundary of its analysis at its national border, the transport electrification story looks like a clean success. Zero domestic tailpipe emissions. Goal achieved. When you draw the boundary at the global carbon system, the picture is more complicated. Norway is simultaneously building the world's most electrified transport system and supplying the rest of the world with the fossil fuels it is replacing domestically. Norway is the world's laboratory for transport electrification. What happens here over the next decade will be studied, copied, and warned about everywhere else. The passenger car story is nearly complete. The hard parts are just beginning. The grid in northern Norway cannot accept new industrial connections. Water from hydro plants is being routed to the sea because the transmission system cannot carry it. The charging infrastructure for heavy trucks is a fraction of what the 2030 target requires. The system is weather dependent in ways that compounds as new demand arrives. Ordinary households are being asked to pay for grid upgrades through rising network tariffs. The resilience architecture of the post-petrol transport system has not been designed, and the country leading the world's greenest transport transition is also one of the world's largest fossil fuel exporters. These are not contradictions that cancel each other out. They are tensions that the complex system carries inside itself, sometimes for decades, until something forces a resolution. Norway did not design a transport system. It designed a passenger car incentive scheme, and it worked brilliantly. Now, the rest of the system is catching up with that success. And the challenges appearing at that frontier are the challenges every electrifying country will encounter just later. The Cascade does not announce itself, it builds. I am Omid Razbani. Thank you for listening to The Cascade. The next episode, we pick a new story and find the system underneath.